In this tutorial, we're going to show you how to bake lighting into your Flipside Studio sets so you can go from this to this. To start things off, we need to first set objects in our scene to the static setting, which you can find at the top rightmost section of each selected object. As you can see, there's this little flag here, it's called static. And if you click the little arrow here, you can see that there's a drop-down menu with a number of different settings that can be toggled on and off. The really important ones are Contribute GI, Batching Static, and Reflection Probe Static, which basically means baked lighting interacts with this object. This object will be combined with other objects in the scene to improve performance at runtime, and also our light probes, or specifically our reflection probes, will include these objects when they capture the 360 cube map images that we'll use on metallic surfaces to fake reflectivity. So basically, like every object in our scene that we want to sit still and have shadows baked onto it will have this static flag enabled, and anything that has that disabled, so for example this little pillar here, that will not receive light map information, and that won't be included in the bake. So I'll save my scene there. So the other thing that I want to touch on a little bit is our actual project Lightmap settings, and you can find that by going to Edit, Project Settings, and you want to go to Player here. And you want to scroll down to Lightmap Encoding, and for most scenes, because we're using the linear color space for our environments, you want to set Lightmap Encoding to normal quality. And that's going to improve lightmap banding, which is an unpleasant side effect that high quality lighting can sometimes have when using linear color space. And it's just something, it's good practice to toggle that on right away before you get into the nitty-gritty of actually lighting your scene. The only other thing that I might touch on also is under quality settings, I'll set the shadow mask mode to shadow mask instead of distance shadow mask, just because we're not using terribly large environments. And then I will close my window there. Okay, so assuming we've got all the objects in our scene set to static, and we have our light map encoding set up correctly, what we need to do next is we want to go under our window, rendering, lighting. And this is the main panel that we use to control our light map settings. And overall, just these are the settings that we'll tweak to get the best bake quality and also fastest bake time that we can for our scene. So there's a number of tabs here, and the first one I want to touch on is the Scene tab. And we'd never really want to enable real-time global illumination because it's very performant heavy. It's actually depreciated. We have a different method for lighting our scene. But we do want to enable baked global illumination, and for lighting mode, we generally will use shadow mask or baked indirect for our settings. For scenes that are outdoors, you'll sometimes use subtractive, but for the most part, these two work really well in tandem, and I generally lean towards shadow mask because we have even more quality controls on that. The Lightmapper settings, which is basically, if you've ever done any rendering or anything like that, it's sort of the same principle, but instead of rendering an image, we're rendering all the shadows of our environment, so all of these settings control that to a certain degree. Things like direct samples, indirect samples, and environment samples, those are how many sort of rays our light sources in the scene will cast out, and depending on how many you put in, it'll either increase the bake time that it takes to get our shadows, but it'll also improve the quality or decrease the amount of noise those maps will have in them. On top of that, we've also got a minimum and maximum bounces, how much those light rays bounce around. If you know anything about light theory, you know when a light ray hits a surface, it'll bounce off. Generally, 2 minimum bounces is good, maybe 3, and a maximum bounce level between like 8 or 12 usually works really well. You can even go to up to 15. And those are some good default settings. There's also my filtering settings. You can normally leave that set to auto. If you're like me and you want to specify exactly what the filtering and particularly the denoising that's going on with the shadow maps, I like to set that to open image denoise because that uses my CPU. It's very high quality. And yeah, like basically what we're doing is we'll bake a noisier image that'll take a lot faster to render, and then we're using filters on top of that to create a less noisy light map result. After that, we're going to set our Lightmap Resolution, which is literally per object how many texels, which is basically the same thing as pixels. And I'll go into my baked Lightmap mode to give you a preview of that. So as you can see, there's all of these gridded squares on things. And what these are, as the name implies, is each one of these is a single texel. And what that means is that each one of these squares is like one pixel of our shadow map that's being projected into 3D space. So like per meter or so, every 1 meter gets 40 pixels or texels of Lightmap resolution. And the amount of padding between each object in the final 4K map, which I'm setting in the max Lightmap size here. You can set that down to 2K, 4K, 1K. Every one of those objects is getting that 40 resolution, and it's getting a padding of 3. So smaller objects will get less of that resolution, bigger objects will get even more of that, and Unity is just trying to pack as many of those objects that we're baking lighting to into a 4K texture, or as few textures as possible. So I could set this to 2K and maybe have more maps, but for VR, generally you want 1 to 2 texture maps because we want to keep our draw calls down as much as possible. You have the option of compressing your light maps, whether you want to enable ambient occlusion, which is the contact shadows between surfaces. Generally, I'll leave both of these on because while compressing your light maps decreases the size of the light maps, they can cause some artifacting, so it'll be a case-by-case basis. If you can get away with leaving those uncompressed, I recommend it. It'll really make your shadows look a little bit nicer. And ambient occlusion, those contact shadows, like I said, those are really nice. I'll generally leave that on at default settings. Maybe I'll decrease the max distance so we have tighter shadows between surfaces. But for the most part, it just adds a really nice overall effect to your scene. Directional mode, if you want real-time lights in your scene, you'll use the directional maps for those. If you don't plan on doing any real-time lighting in your scene at all, setting this to non-directional is fine. It can actually decrease the size of your asset bundles because you're not baking 2 lighting maps, you're only baking 1 map. We'll leave that at directional for now. And albedo boost and indirect intensity, both of these affect different things. Albedo boost increases the color intensity of surfaces. So if I go back, increasing this will make it so these surfaces that are like red, green, blue, or things like that, those will be more intense and affect how much color is going into those light rays as they're bouncing around. Generally, I'll leave that at default, and indirect intensity works on the opposite side of things. It multiplies the intensity of all the lighting in your scene by a certain amount, and it just globally increases the intensity of your lighting. It's really nice if you have a scene that's maybe too dark and you don't want to manually tweak every single light source. You can instead just increase the intensity there. And yeah. The only other thing is Lightmap parameters. Generally, I'll leave that at medium for now. And that comes up more if you have a lot of texel baking errors or things like that. Maybe you're using a very high Lightmap resolution, so 60 or maybe even 80 for very high detail shadows. I'll maybe bump that to the high resolution parameters, but medium works well in most cases. And that's pretty much all the main light settings. I also have my environment tab over here. This is how I affect the global scene lighting that I want to bake into my scene. So I have a skybox that can actually project lighting into my scene if I set it up that way. I've got a sun source. This doesn't have to be signed in. This is something that a dynamic skybox will reference when you're positioning the sun in that. So the default skybox will use that, but for the most part, we don't have to plug that in. Real-time shadow color, that's if you're using a dynamic global illumination, if you want a specific color for your real-time shadows. And what I really want to pay attention to is the environment lighting tab here, because here I can set either a skybox lighting, a gradient lighting, which I actually prefer for most scenes, as well as just a flat color lighting. And what these do is they basically change how the environment is lighting your scene. So instead of using a complex skybox, which Unity will sample the colors in your skybox and then try its best to apply it to your scene, I instead want a gradient, which is literally, if you think about it as sky, equator, and ground as the 3 places, whereas like the equator is the point where the sky and your ground meet. You'll set these 3 different colors to create a gradient between them. So you have like a little bit more control than using the flat color, but it's more performant than using the skybox. And the best part is once I have this locked in my scene environment, I can actually go to my set info and I can literally just scroll down to copy scene lighting, and I'll pull those exact values. So like say I tweak these settings here like so, and then I copy my scene lighting. These variables are already punched in, and because I'm using the tri-light mode, the scene lighting that I have in this environment will be the exact same when I bring it into Flipside Studio. So it's just it's a ease of consistency thing that I like to use tri-light. And there we go. I also have my environment reflections, which I'm actually going to drop the resolution on that because it doesn't seem like much. What the environment reflections is the default cube map, which is a large high-resolution image that reflective surfaces reference to create the illusion of reflectivity. In layman's terms, it's your reflections of the environment. So by default, it'll use the skybox, and because it's just like a solid image, having a really low resolution will increase performance and not really affect the quality of things. I like to leave compression at auto. And that's, for the most part, it as far as my scene lighting settings. But now that I've got the scene lighting settings where I generally want them, I also want to look at the actual light sources in my environment. So as you can see, I've already placed a directional light, several point lights, and I think a light probe group. So going in order, the directional light is basically acting as my sun. It's light that just goes in one direction. As you can see, it's got an intensity of 0.7, so it's a little low. I've got soft shadows with like a very wide baked shadow angle, which means basically when a light ray hits the corner of a surface, it's going to sort of diffusely radiate out. If that makes any sense. Basically, you'll have the higher this value, the softer your shadows are going to look. And I also have several point lights, and these are accent lights, so they have shadows disabled on them, and they're just placed around my scene to bump up the lighting in a couple of different places strategically. Then after that, I have my light probe group, and what this object is instead of concentrating on the light maps of my scene, this is for the real-time objects that are going to go around that. So characters, props, anything that is animated that isn't set to static are going to reference these probes. And I've strategically placed them around different points. As you walk between these different probes, the color affecting your character will sort of blend between the two. So you're really paying attention to like what colors are my probes, in a brightly lit spot or any of them dark, and you can preview them by actually enabling light probe visualization, either all probes no cells or all probes with cells, and that'll show you different preview modes for how your light probes are behaving. So we'll leave that for now. And yeah, I've got my point lights, I've got my directional lights, maybe I'll add a spotlight. So let me duplicate one of these point lights here. Turn it into a spotlight, get that into position, like so, rotate it. Just want something kind of big like that, so. Just affecting the angle and position of that light, so I want it sort of shooting down into this area here. And I'll increase the intensity a bit and give it a little bit of color. And soft shadows, and I'll lower the shadow angle on this, make it just like 5 or 6. And yeah, that should do it. So I've got my general texture settings, I've got all my lighting set up. So now all I need to do to actually see how my scene is going to bake is I'm going to hit generate lighting, and as soon as that's finished, we can see how well the light bake went. Our light bake has finished, and this is what the set looks like. The only other thing I really want to check now is make sure that my light probes are working correctly. Let me go back to gizmos, and under my lighting tab, I'm going to set these to all probes no cells. so that I'm not seeing how those probes are connected to each other. And each one of these probes is looking pretty good. Kind of a darker one in that corner there maybe. But if I take, say, a 3D object like this sphere here and just drag it around my environment, see how it darkens when I walk off the stage, and very brightly lit here. Walk up over here, and I might have like a few different objects that I just check that with, or just bring it into Flipside Studio and see how my characters are lit there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I'll just, if I do have a light mapping problem, I'll just iteratively work on my Lightmap settings. Maybe I'll increase the resolution or the number of samples or something like that, or change my filter settings until I get the quality of light map that I want. But for the most part, once my scene lighting is looking good, and here's that object from before that I disabled lighting on, once everything's looking good, I just have to save my scene, and then in Flipside Creator Tools, when I hit Build and Export, or Build and Publish Set, it's going to push both the scene as well as my new baked lighting up to Flipside, and I can view it in VR, which I'm going to go do right now. Okay, here I am in Flipside Studio. Just like usual, I'm going to hit the menu button, go to the Sets menu, then All Sets, and to the Imported category. I'm going to scroll down and click on my set. As you can see, I added a character stand-in earlier to show how the lighting affects real-time objects like avatars or props. All my shadows are baked in, and my scene lighting is looking pretty nice. This has been baking your lighting into your sets for Flipside Studio, and hope you learned a lot.